Chapter 7, Bone Fracture and the Sanctuary of the Medicine God. The Church. It was an international group that ruled regions both within and outside the continent. Even though they are a religious group, their influence was beyond the scope of just a religious organization. The Church appraises the guardian deity of the divine art user during baptism, which is performed soon after birth. The divine pulse would be opened through a blessing and will give them the qualification as a noble. In addition to those who had been considered to lack the qualities of a noble, their divine pulse will be closed by force and their social position will drop to a commoner. Any nobles who decide to rebel against the Church are banished for eternity. When an emperor or a king of a country was chosen, the Church too would present them their royal staff and crown, officially granting them the authority. Therefore, the power of the Church exceeds that of an empire, and they wouldn't even mind starting an all-out war with the Empress of Saint-Flouf if they were determined to do so. The fact that Falma was only a second son of an archduke, who was only the chief apothecary employed by the Saint-Flouf Empire, didn't matter to the Church, as they simply didn't care. They decided that Falma was a non-human, and would be wiped out as a heretic. There are a total of 7 Inquisition officers riding on their horses. It was a gathering of divine art users from all 4 attributes. Since Falma was feigning to be a divine art user of both water and wind, he was fighting back with ease without exposing his secret. An attack from the ground from an earth attribute user would be defended by laying a layer of ice on the ground. The flame from a fire attribute user would be erased with the negative ability. The windstorm from the wind attribute user would be met by the shield made of a wall of ice toying with the horse using a water spout to make the rider fall. And attack them physically with ice pebbles to destroy their wands and neutralize them. Alone against 7 highly experienced users. The boy jumped around places while showing composure, while the Inquisition officers began to show signs of fear and impatience. The ice barrier that contained Falma's divine power was much tougher than any metal, as it withstood the brunt of fire attacks and was fully insulated from heat. In addition to that, the attacks that were known only by the Church, which were meant for crushing evil beings, weren't of use to them, as Falma was not an evil spirit. They could only monotonously and simultaneously attack using the 4 basic attributes in a crossfire battle formation. It was probably the first time the 7 knights weren't able to exorcise a heretic. To prevent them from noticing that he had a material creation ability, Falma fought back with his chantless water divine art. Still, because the Inquisition officers exhaust their divine power every time they used divine arts, the power of their divine arts would decline over the period of battle. The Inquisition group was getting exhausted, but it was the complete opposite to Falma, because as he used more of his divine art, his physical ability seemed to be increasing. The Inquisition officer sensed that divine power was gradually accumulating around Falma. In addition, it was to be expected that the power of his divine art should have decreased, but the divine power within his body wasn't being sucked dry like theirs. Rather, the divine power was swelling up inside of Falma, the officers suspecting that it might be flowing in from somewhere else. Why wait? Since a little while ago, let alone having no shadow, Falma's body began to glow in reaction to the excitement of the divine power. Don't you all look a little tired? However, Falma was still continuously receiving successive attacks, only barely able to take a breath. The situation was getting nowhere, and the end doesn't seem to be in sight. Therefore, Falma decided to threaten them. He swung his arm lightly up, and drew a line on the air with his left hand. At the beginning, it was just a line studded with small ice crystals. Before it became enormous with amazing speed along with a roaring sound. In a flash it became an iceberg, so big that it shared the same space as the sky, making it impossible for them to escape anywhere. The boy was smiling as the iceberg was floating overhead. If the boy decided to swing his fingers downwards, there was no doubt anymore that everyone would be squished to death by the iceberg. The horses began to rampage, and the Inquisition officers were thrown off their seats onto the ground. Just by its presence alone, they lost the will to fight by the pressure of the iceberg that covered the sky. Even if they fired off a large flame in desperation, it was powerless in front of the iceberg that seemed to grow much more bigger. Now I am completely the bad guy. While Falma felt dejected, he wasn't disheartened, since he had already threatened them. He did the job thoroughly, so that they couldn't escape. Icicles from the iceberg dropped from the iceberg, striking into the ground, completely surrounding them, amplifying their fear. The Inquisition officers pissed themselves and foam could be seen frothing out of their mouths. The Inquisition officers were divine art battle experts that the Church are proud of. Every one of them realized it now, in the face of overwhelming difference in ability, that they were already resolved to die. Their fate now rested upon Falma's fingertip. At that time, the body of one of the Inquisition officers was cramping in fear so much that he saw the pale-colored glow of Falma's arm that was manipulating the iceberg as a halo. "I truly do not want to do this," he called out to them with a well-projected voice. "I came to this world to heal people." He was granted a second life, and when he obtained numerous abilities, he was aware of his mission. Falma didn't have a wand. He was grasping tightly on his medical bag, since he didn't bring it to protect himself. He truly believed that there was a patient here, and he came alone for that reason. "If I don't do anything, will you return quietly?" Both arms of Falma were emitting a pale blue light. Also, it could be clearly seen over the long sleeves of his white gown something that closely resembles the divine crest of the medicine god. As someone belonging to the Church, there was no way they would know. Inexhaustible divine power, divine crest of the medicine god, and a body with no shadow. "I see." The leader of the Inquisition officers seemed to have finally realized something. "We made a mistake. We have eyes but can't see empty. Our eyes were clouded. Why weren't we able to see?" "Wah, don't tell me." One after another, the men realized it too. A body possessed by a god doesn't have a shadow, because that body will glow. That gentleman is the medicine god. With that, Falma was bewildered as the men began to greatly mistake him for a god. It seemed that the lightning scar with Lichtenberg pattern was clearly visible. It was also the same case for Ellen and his father too. But for Falma, it only looked like lightning scar or fungal infection. What's the use of wearing a long-sleeved white robe if it's visible? It seems that their guilt began to heat up towards Falma. "This is a mortal sin. Everyone, submit your life. Because we blasphemed against a god." Wah, wah, wah. The Inquisition officers threw their body to the ground and prostrated themselves with force before Falma. "God of medicine, we have done a grievous thing. We are absolutely sorry. We offer our life in atonement, so please calm your anger." Because they said it while weeping. "Well, calm down at once. Because I won't do anything." They didn't hear what Falma said and ignored him, while they aimed their wand into their forehead to kill themselves. It seems that it was in their manual that if they commit a mistake that they should commit suicide. "Wait, you don't need to kill yourselves. Stop." Falma stopped their reckless behavior. "Just don't tell the Church. If you all don't meddle with me in the future, then everything is fine." Falma already threatened them enough, and was about to remove the iceberg. Then, the towering giant iceberg that was floating completely disappeared, and the clear sky appeared overhead, leaving only a small puddle on the ground. There was no trace of the divine art at all, as if they woke up from a nightmare. "Will you be able to forgive us?" Perhaps because they didn't want to die, one of the men shot Falma a pleading expression. "I don't really approve of reasons such as sacrificing your life to atone your sins of blaspheming against a god." The determination of the man prostrating on the ground, who was the leader, was firm. After becoming injured like this, it won't take long anymore. When the leader rolled up his robe, the bone of the shin of the left leg jutted out of the skin. When he fell from the horse, he was probably unlucky to have broken his bone. "From here on out my body will fester. Sooner or later, I will die. I will take responsibility." Falma examined the man's lower limb with diagnosis I. Open bone fracture. Falma held his breath. If their red light burns after the diagnosis, Falma won't be able to manage it. However, the light that glowed was white. In addition, the opened section wasn't that large, the wound wasn't dirty, the main arteries weren't damaged, and if the contamination was low, there was still a chance. If there was sufficient treatment in this case, amputation will not be needed. Leg amputation, the light was red. If he amputated it, it might lead to sepsis and infection. Reposition, the light was white. It seems this can be a treatment. This can heal him. However, Falma was in the midst of a conundrum. That is, Japanese Medical Practitioners Act, Article 17. No person except a medical practitioner shall engage in medical practice. As a pharmacist, they are allowed to measure and visually inspect vital signs, examination by stethoscope and at most by palpation. They are only able to cure what medicines could cure, but anything beyond that was not allowed. It was a criminal act that was prohibited in Japan. But should I just leave him alone and let him die? My diagnosis, I said that it can be healed. However, does the diagnosis, I say, Falma can heal it? It doesn't really give out instructions like, it can only be healed by a surgeon or an orthopedist. It can be healed in theory. But without knowing that it should be done in a certain way, was completely different than just being able to do it. Falma was a complete amateur when it comes to surgery, and the other person hasn't gone through a procedure either. Falma was just a pharmacologist. To ascertain the medicine's potency, it wasn't always necessary, but he had used animals to test it. He had abundant experience in operating surgically with animals only. This is probably divine punishment. Please kill me. Taking a glance at you before dying, I am glad to have met a god. Even in agony, the expression of the leader of the Inquisition was rather refreshing. The treatment room of the pharmacy was smashed and not usable. Medic is quite the distance away. If treatment is delayed, it will develop to necrosis. Should I just do it here? Falma created a board of iron on the ground, laid the injured person on top of it and applied anesthesia. Forget everything you are about to see. Although they were shown the material creation ability, they weren't afraid anymore. They weren't suspicious anymore. Get a carriage that will transport an injured person. Yes. As you command. Grabbing his medical bag, Falma gave a few words to the Inquisition officers, and he took out a clean vinyl sheet inside the bag and pitched a tent. He made a simple treatment room and went in. He washed his hands with the water generated by his divine art, and disinfected his hands with alcohol and wore plastic gloves that was already disinfected beforehand. He took out several bottles of isotonic saline solution that was made of distilled water, and washed the open wound thoroughly. Shaving the section which was dirty with a sterilized knife, he applied an antibiotic that he chose that would work for a wide range of bacteria. While confirming it with diagnosis he struck the pin to lock the sterilized stainless steel bolt holding the bones, and he closed the wound while putting a tube to discharge bodily fluids. I wonder if this is good. Lastly, he examined the wound with diagnosis The white light was becoming dimmer and fading away, although not completely. Will it heal properly? Falma doesn't know. As Falma came out of the tent, the Inquisition officers, who were waiting, were prostrating themselves and was offering a prayer. God of medicine. Even though we had aimed at taking your life and it's only justified to kill us for that. Yet we received such compassion from you. My expertise is on medicine only, so I don't know if I have really saved him, but I did all that I can do. Since the anesthesia is still working on the injured person, he is still sleeping. He doesn't know whether or not that person will die, as he can't see the level of infection. But he thought it was better than doing nothing. He patted himself in the back, but him wanting to dabble in surgery without the proper skill was a crime, was Falma thought. However, who in this world would have the skill with the highest probability of survival? Who can administer antibiotic during surgery, thoroughly wash the wound, and can close the wound while considering for possible infection? Unfortunately, Falma was the only one. Falma had seen the latest surgery, that of the physicians of this world, from the performance records out of Novarud Medical University. For open bone fracture, they amputate the limbs without hesitation, cover the wounds with a gauze and resign themselves to fate. They don't seem to mind that the wound will fester at all, as a total of 70% of the amputated died from sepsis. Taking in large amounts of potions and painkillers doesn't make the difference in the death rate. This was common to this world. Even inspecting the surgery records of the court physician and the chief court physician, Claude, it was all or nothing that led to unfortunate consequences. Anyway, it is strictly forbidden to tell anyone what you saw today. Otherwise, he was worried if the last line would effective at threatening the people of the church. I will curse you. He said it with a dominating voice and a straight face. He. The Inquisition officers trembled violently. It seems that attempts to reveal what had happened had been completely discouraged. To those who believed in God, it was very effective to say a curse of God. However, Falma didn't thought that he already assumed himself as the medicine god with those few words. By the time the church's carriage that was summoned arrived, the page of the Empress, Noah, led an Imperial Guard division of the Empire. They rushed at full speed. Noah and the Imperial Guards were fully armed. The first thing they did was to confirm Falma was intact. After that, Noah faced the Inquisition officers and announced himself. Gentlemen of the church, what business do you have to the chief apothecary of our empire? In a polite and stern tone, he checked the Inquisition officers. They looked at each other, seemed troubled on how to reply. Something happened here that caused them to harbor guilty emotions when Noah was going to investigate. There was an injured person here, so I treated him. Falma, who had finished tidying up all sorts of tools into his medical bag, responded in a cheerful voice. Other than anything else, it looked like nothing had happened. Why are you here, Noah? That over there, one of the Imperial Guards was pulling Falma's horse. That fellow told me. Horses from the Archduke's house has been trained well as expected. Because it was agitated. I thought there was something wrong. Falma's horse had received training to tell about the danger and come back to the previous place as soon as something happened to its master. Because only the horse returned to the pharmacy, Noah found something was amiss and rushed with the soldiers. Perchance, was it your organization which was responsible for the crashing wagons to the pharmacy? Assuming that it is, I think that our Empress would like to have a word with the church. Noah asked the Inquisition officers sharply, but they denied it vehemently and swore in the name of the gods of heaven and earth. For a while they were arguing back and forth, but Falma saw that the sun had begun to wane and suddenly remembered the pharmacy. I will return to the pharmacy. Mr. Cedric and the townspeople are waiting, because we still need to tidy up. Don't move the injured person as much as possible. Move the carriage to the residence of the Medicis family, is what Falma said to them. Well then, when he said it, he swung his medical bag over his shoulder while looking exhausted, and mounted his horse and tottered back home. Noah and the Imperial Guards were surprised that the Inquisition officers were prostrating and rubbing their foreheads to the ground as they bid Falma off. It was an unprecedented story. The Inquisition officers lowered their head and prostrated to the ground to a mere noble, despite being only a son of an archduke. What was that about? Hey, what was that all about? Noah tilted his head in contemplation. The Imperial Guards also looked in wonder. After that, although Noah thoroughly asked the Inquisition officers, not one of them were willing to speak out. Everyone was awfully frightened. After that, in the report of the Guardian Church in the parish of Saint-Fleuve Empire, it said, in the Diocese of Saint-Fleuve, there was no heretic or boy with no shadow, and that was then submitted to the Great Church. The story about the boy with no shadow was left unsettled, and it was treated as a mere rumor. Divine power accumulating, and like those in the report, was deemed false. So the priests in the Marseille parish were all subjected to demotion. The accumulated divine power was disappearing recently. The Inquisition officer, who was treated by Falma, took office as the head priest of the Saint-Fleuve parish, and the remaining 6 Inquisition officers were transferred to a different parish. Afterwards, anonymous tips about the child owner of the Different World Pharmacy having no shadow were all suppressed by the head priest of the parish. Thus, the local church deemed the Different World Pharmacy as a sanctuary. At the hill in San Fluve Empire, the accumulated divine power still hadn't disappeared even now. Flowers bloomed beautifully there, lush grass grew thickly, it overflowed with small life, it became a healing spot for visitors. So what else happened there? There was nothing to talk about anymore.